Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of the OpenText Live webinar series. My name is Carrie Lynn Scott, and I'll be moderating today's call. With me today are Martin Tietz, Product Manager, Gupta, and Gary Betancourt, Software Development Manager. And they are here to present what's new in OpenText Gupta Team Developer 7.1. If you have a question for our presenters at any time during today's call, simply type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will ask your questions at the end of the presentation and allow our presenter to answer. If we're unable to get to your question today, I will send our presenter all of the questions asked, and they will follow up with you directly after the call. Finally, today's session is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the PowerPoint and recording later on the OpenText Knowledge Center. And we'll also send you an email with these materials within the next couple of days. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Martin, and we can get started.
Thank you, Carrie. Let me just share my screen. And here we go. So welcome from my side as well. I'm going to show you what's new in OpenText Gupta Team Developer 7.1, which we will soon launch. And after I'm talking about the product benefits and features, Gary Betancourt, the Manager of Software Development for Team Developer, will do a product demonstration, and then we will have a question and answer session. So here's the entire agenda. First, I'm going to talk about TD 7.1 application multi-threading, TD 7.1 source code version control. I'm going to talk about the UX enhancements that come with Team Developer 7.1, about programmer productivity. We'll do the demonstration so you see live what this is going to do and going to give you, and then the Q&A session. So what are the benefits of Team Developer multi-threading? Basically, you will get higher application usability and higher user productivity. Always responsive applications allow users to keep being productive when the app is executing heavy processing tasks. So you can move processing tasks that are running longer, like complex database operations, complex file I/O, fetching email, or whatever you are doing, into a background thread, and the user interface will remain responsive at the same time. And employees, for example, can continue to look up data, work on their normal tasks while things are being processed in the background. All this follows the easy TD object-oriented programming approach, so you will find it easy to implement this because it's just like using functional classes, for example, in Team Developer. And we also spent a lot of time to make it very easy to debug, and we will show you that as well later today. So you can debug your multiple threads and main task or main UI thread at the same time. So here's kind of the application architecture. There's basically two areas in the code that contain threading-related code. The thread code itself is in a background worker class here, and this background worker class at the bottom has actions, and these actions are just plain SAL code without any GUI interaction here. And you have like local variables that can be initiated when the thread starts and things like that. And it can also be derived from functional classes, so we can use functional classes to basically put code into a background worker thread. Now on the other side, on the user interface side, you define instances of the thread. And in this code here, you'll see that there's a new outline item, background threads, and there are two threads defined here, and each of the threads has an event section, and there are like 4 events. There's a thread before start event, there's a thread report progress event, report error event, and thread finished event. So here, these are listed here a little larger. So before start, you get an event notification, report progress, so you can tell the user, your thread has processed 10% of the entire process, and so on. And you also get a notification when an error has happened, like in the thread, the database connection is broken down or whatever. And then there's another notification when the thread finished. So basically, there's an event dispatcher between those two code segments. And once the thread start has been issued from the client side, then the thread code will be executed, and then the thread code will report back things to the user interface like progress, thread finish, or in case of errors. So if you're going to implement threads in your TD applications, you need to create a background worker class which contains the thread code and thread class instance variables. These cannot have any GUI interaction. The only way you talk to the GUI is via the events, and we will go into the functions that facilitate that in a minute or so. Once you have designed created your background worker class, you can add background thread instances to a team developer window. And in that window code, then you can start the background thread using this function here, start background worker start, and then the name of the instance. So this will start the thread and trigger the events of the thread instance then. So it's actually quite easy. And here are the thread events. There are some things to know about this. The first one is thread before starts. So that is called when the thread is being called, and you can put your initialization code here, initialize the thread class variables, and this is a synchronous event, so unless this returns, the actual thread code will not execute. Then you have the ability to use the thread report progress event, which will be raised on the form, and you will need to use the function start background worker report progress from the thread code to basically initiate such an event. So you have two parameters for that function. You can pass a number for a % progress or whatever other number you want to pass, and a string for a message that you want to pass on into the GUI code. This is an asynchronous event, so the thread continues to run without waiting for a response from the GUI side. Thread finished is raised when the thread code has finished execution. You can use it to update the user interface with thread results, and again, an asynchronous event. Thread error happens when an unhandled error is thrown by the thread. You should, if there is an error condition in the thread code, you should pass over that thread, the error, into the GUI using this error messaging that we implemented, and do not use your own dialogues from the thread code itself, because that doesn't work. I think that will throw probably a compiler error before. And again, thread error is an asynchronous event, so if the user interface is idle, it will handle that event. So here are the API functions for threading. Start background worker start. That one starts the actual thread code. With background worker report progress, you do send the progress value and the text message to the user interface of the application that can then be displayed to the user. We can find out if a thread is actually running, the start background worker is busy. You can do a start background worker cancel, which tells the background thread that it should actually stop. And on the thread, you have to check every once in a while, this one here, start background worker is canceled. And if this is true, then you should stop executing the thread, because the UI has basically said, the user wants to stop that thread. And there's another handy function, start background worker any running, which tells you if any of any threads that are defined on the current open windows are running. So that is helpful when when the user wants to close the application and you need to check if things are still running and close down in a nice way before totally executing the application. So another overview of the thread lifecycle. It starts with the initialization. You spawn the new worker thread. You initialize the variables and properties to run the thread. Then the thread execution commences. You can do the notification with style background worker report progress. And there are ways, finished is automatic, but on error conditions, then you will need to bring up your own error message from the UI side and not from the thread side. So overall, I think that's a very reasonable and very TD-like implementation that follows the TD object-oriented programming implementation very nicely. You can also do thread debugging with TD 7.1. The debug windows menu has a new menu item called threads window, this one here. And if you open that, you get a new debug window threads. And this is basically how debugging looks like for threads. You see that this thread debug window lists the currently active thread, and they also list the state the thread is in. So that the main UI thread is running. Then one thread is being debugged, the one in red, and one thread is suspended, which is waiting to be debugged, basically. And in the code, you see that you can now have multiple places where the current code executes. The active one is this one here with the dark arrow, and this one is the suspended one, which is waiting to be activated, basically by the debugger. And you can use this window to switch the state of each of these threads, so you can walk through and debug all of the threads that are currently running. A few words on source code version control, the other big feature in Team Developer 7.1. We do support Git for source version control. You can access and use Git repositories right from within the Team Developer IDE. You can also do that with Subversion. So Git and Subversion are both very popular open source management system, which can now be accessed right from within Team Developer. And it also works with Team Foundation Server by the Git interface of Microsoft Team Foundation Server. So there are a few differences between Subversion and Git, just a high-level overview on that. In a Git repository that you download from a server contains all details, including branches, and there's a change branch link available in the TD Git dialog. And with Subversion, the structure is different. With Subversion, you do multiple checkouts to get the trunk and branches, and you get easy navigation with the TD Subversion dialog for that. So the dialogs that are have been implemented in TD accommodate for the differences in Git and Subversion. So the Git integration, basically the buttons here and here, they are specific to the version control system you are using and how that system behaves. So with Git, you can work with multiple clone projects and branches. You can open application source right from this file tree here. You just double-click on this file name, and it opens the source, which is really nice. So I think Gary will show you that later on. And in Git, you have that commit tree as well here that you see. And in Git, a commit really is just local. And in Git, when you want to push everything out to the combined repository or to the network repository, then you do a push. Or you do a pull to receive the changes from the network repository. We allow you to do a diff on the file, different versions of a file. You can commit changes to the local repository, I mentioned that. And you do have a visual indication of modified files. So if a file is modified, then the file name will display in red here. And during the beta program, we have been asked that we want, we are using the diff tool that we have with Team Object Manager for the diff, but several people are using other tools like WinMerge, I think is one of the names, or WinDiff, forgot the exact name. And in the property dialog for the source code control, you can provide your own diff tool, so you can that will be launched instead of our own. So in Subversion, and basically what you do is you do a checkout of a certain path, and if you do a commit in Subversion, that commit goes right to the network repository, and an update pulls the updates from the repository. Other than that, it pretty much works the same. You have that structure here, and you just double-click on a file to open that file. If it has been edited or modified, it will show in red until you do a commit. So we do have sample projects set up on SourceForge, which is a Subversion open source public repository. And this is the URL for that. If you have an account on these sites, you will have full access to that, and you can use that as a starting point for your Team Developer 7.1 exploration, basically. So what about user interface enhancements? First one is the custom theme. With Team Developer 7.1, you can now create your own custom theme and modify the visual layout of basically every visual aspect of Team Developer applications. You'll see that in the screenshot to the right. What I did is, it doesn't really look too great, but I took some of the open text marketing colors that we use and used them to create a new theme for Team Developers. That's just, a very basic thing that I did here, but you can see that I can access pretty much any detail here, like ribbon button colors, grid header rows, grid line headers, font sizes, font types, background colors. So anything you can think of, you can modify. The whole thing basically starts with an XML file and a directory structure that contains the images that are being used for all the different graphical user interface controls. And there's just really two functions that you can use to set a theme. The first one is style theme set XML path name. This one you give the location of that XML file that contains your own theme definition. And with this call here, style theme set, having the parameter theme skin, you activate that skin to your Team Developer application. So the theme XML file is a bit like HTML. It's not exactly HTML language, but works pretty much like HTML. It's a very nicely formatted XML file where you easily see, what object defines what thing, what object in Team Developer. And you basically, you see that here for a combo box, you have the different options for the combo image options for the combo box frame, for example. And you see that for a normal state, a disabled state, a hover over state, and a pressed state. So you can provide different images for all these states. And that's true for basically every control that Team Developer has. So there are several properties in that XML file that you can use, the draw method for images, hollow, stretch, center, tile, horizontal, tile, vertical, tile. You have things like in HTML, padding, top, left, bottom, right, content padding, and borders. So these are the things just on a high level that you will see in that XML file. And there's this directory structure. So basically there's a directory for every type of control that team developer has. And that directory holds all the images required for the different states of an object. So a normal state image, a default state, has focus image, hover over state, pressed state, and disabled state. And you can modify all of these and provide your own company user interface or whatever design you want to use. Yeah. So the next user interface thing are the .NET WPF controls. We did have support for those on .NET build types before, and we do have support for them on Win32 and Win64 build types now as well. So basically, you can use these more modern WPF controls instead of ActiveX controls, for example, on Win32 and Win64. And another feature that we implemented in Team Developer 7.1 is that you can preview the controls, the .NET WPF controls now in the IDE Layout Designer. And you see the screenshot below shows the design mode. And before you would just see an empty rectangle here, and now you see the rendering of the control, including the properties that have been applied in the XAML snippet for the control. So a WPF control consists of properties, methods, events, and the class definition and properties XAML. So this is basically the definition here. This is the XAML that, for example, puts a web browser onto a team developer form. This web browser object is provided by Microsoft and is part of Microsoft's .NET WPF controls. That's why it's such simple to include that here. If it were to be a WPF control provided by somebody else, you would also need to provide a namespace and assembly name here. So there's a little more code to specify here, but it works equally. So the methods, if you look at the browser control that Microsoft has, for example, you have a go back and go forward method for the web browser class that you can use. And there are also WPF control events. So the events the programmers can react on. So in most cases, WPF controls do support many events, and TD can trap WPF control events like they are being fired or when they are being fired. And there's one WPF event message, which basically is sent for all the WPF events that a control raises. And you have a keyword, which is WPF event name, and this one contains then the actual event name. So you can easily create a simple application to test the WPF control where you trap the WPF events and put all the events that arrive into a list box to see what kind of events a control fires, for example. So here's the event file code. You see it's on-thems WPF event. If WPF event name equals media ended, so this is for a media player. We are opening a message box here, so that's how that works. And there are 4 or 8 functions to read the properties of WPF controls and set the properties from the SAR language. So that there's a function to get the string properties of a WPF control, a numeric, a date property, and a Boolean property, and the same to set the properties. You can invoke WPF control methods, so you basically need the documentation of a WPF control to know the name of the methods. So in that function SAL WPF invoke method, you pass in the name of the WPF control, then the method name, and then an array of arguments and an sReturn where you can receive a return message. So this is the way how you invoke the WPF control methods. So other UX things, grid group totals and summary bar totals for time and date values. So customers wanted to be able to display like a summary value for date time columns, maybe add up the labor time for a week and show that in a group and have that column be grouped by a week, for example. So and to do though, we have created a new event, stem date column sum, which will be fired automatically when that is being processed. And then you actually need to do some work on your own with SciGrid column summary date values to extract the data of the column in an array, and you can process or do any math with that data, and then return the values to the group or to the summary bar. You also now have images in tooltips, so you can provide resource images and image files to tooltips to display them in a tooltip. You can use that at design time and runtime, and there's a new function for that, starset tooltip image. Programmer productivity. This is what we provide for improved productivity for the developers. You can now navigate back and forth between code sections. You have new buttons in the outline and in the outline toolbar, which are these here. So very easy navigation back and forth between the visited code. And then a rather big improvement, I think, is this one here, the active coding assistant enhancements. So the hover over micro help and other help that is being displayed through the coding assistant is now also working for functions that you coded if you provide the help in the function. So here in this function, if the function has a description, this will be displayed, and every parameter can have some help if you provide that help right after the code here of the definition of the variable. This works for your internal functions. It also works for external functions if comment subnode is present, and it also works for all TD built-in functions. So you probably never need to buy a new keyboard again because you're pressing F1 too frequently. These times are over. What you get now is this. You see that coding assistant help, or that help here, that comes up when you have inserted a function from the coding assistant. Then the first parameter is highlighted, and you see that that parameter is highlighted in the help as well, and the associated help is displayed in that micro help window. And you can move to the next item, and then you see that the next value is being displayed. So if you just highlight the function or select the function, then you get the entire help for the function that you have provided in your code. This is the quick info that you get from the right-click menu if you click on that. And here's one example for SQL prepare and execute. So a built-in system function has built-in help now as well. So you can read exactly from here. And as I said, the times of F1 to get help are probably pretty much over now. Another thing we added is this new window functions tab. So if you are working on the code of a window, you can simply change to that functions tab, and you have the code for that window. So this is code navigation and productivity for developers. Other things, a few little things. We do now have an Informix 64-bit database driver. You can assign one control to multiple tab pages. The toggle bookmark menu item is now in the edit menu of the IDE. And you know that feature, when you double click on a control, it adds the default message into the code. This behavior can now be configured in the preferences dialog, so you can switch that on and off if you don't want to have that, and keep creating unwanted message sections, basically. A few more things. You can have background images for MDIs. There's a few new functions for that. And switch off errors when opening source files. So if you are loading larger projects and want to load anyway, even if there are errors coming up, you can say don't display this message again, and it will load the file without the error messages, without breaking up. And a last nice little thing, if you should have issues with Team Developer, we now include debug files with the Team Developer installer. Our support and engineering might ask you to install those to find out issues that you might encounter in the product. But that's a support and maintenance feature that we have decided to put in to make supporting very difficult problems much easier. So what about availability? Team Developer 7.1 will be available the morning of May 29, 2018, Eastern Time. So be ready for that and get your warranty version. You can then also request your product media code to install your version. Or if you need upgrades, contact sales, and we will be happy to provide you a quote for the Team Developer 7.1 upgrades. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Gary, really, and he will demonstrate the product for you. So the ball is moving over to Gary.
All right, thank you, Martin. So I'll be showing you some of the features that Martin just presented that are new in Team Developer 7.1. First, I'd like to show the new source control pane that we've added. So this new source control pane is accessible via the Tools menu here. And it gives you quick access to high-level commands that Git and Subversion expose. When you first access this pane, you'll be asked to configure which source control provider you'd like to use, either Subversion or Git. As Martin mentioned, you can also access TFS via its Git interface that Visual Studio supports. This setting is saved in the new IDE Preferences tab, so you can change this after the fact as well. So I will select Git and click on Save Selection. And this is the interface that you would see now every time you bring up the IDE. As you can see up top here, we have the high-level commands that we support against Git, which would be clone, which is how you actually check out a repository. You can commit changes, push those changes to your remote repository, and then pull in updates from the remote repository. Right now, I don't have any repositories cloned, so I will go ahead and clone one that I have on out on GitHub here. So this is just one I created for our developers conference last year. It has several Team Developer demos in folders. So this is the repository URL. I'll go and copy that to my clipboard and click on Clone. And I'll paste that URL here, and then I will provide a local directory for this repository to be cloned into. And my repository doesn't require credentials to do a clone, so I'll just leave that empty. I hope I already have an existing directory there, so let me try that again with a unique directory name. So all my files here are displayed in this file tree. So this is the window into the repository. And this is just a tree structure, so you can expand these out to view the files in each one. By default, we only show team developer files in this tree, but you can optionally view all the files that are in the repository and toggle that on and off. It's really easy to open these files up. You just go ahead and double click on them, and you can open up the file here. Now up top, you'll see a drop down where you can switch between the repositories you've cloned. Now you can also add existing repositories you might have already cloned through, say, the Git command line tool. You can view information about the selected repository. You can change your branch so you can check out a different branch if you like. And then here we list all the outstanding commits you have not yet pushed to the remote repository. So I'll make just a simple change to this application and save it. And you'll notice that we now display this application in red to indicate that there is a change. So it's been modified in the working directory. I can view the differences for this file here. That brings up, by default, our Tom diff tool, so you can see the difference here. But you can also configure your own diff and merge tools in the new source control tab under IDE preferences. So here we will auto-detect several popular diff tools and enable those that you have installed. So I have Tortoise Merge installed. So I can go ahead and uncheck this option that I don't want to use the Team Developer diff tool and rather use Tortoise Merge. So if I go back and diff this, then we will go ahead and run this third-party diff tool. And you can do this for merges as well. So I can commit this change. I'll just say I'm going to update the title, commit it. The first time you do a commit or a push or something that requires credentials, we will prompt for credentials, but this will be cached, so you don't have to do that again. So I've made that commit here, and you can see that's going to be displayed here. So these are outstanding commits that have not yet been pushed. I'll go ahead and push these changes to the server. And that finished. If I go here to the commits tab, you'll see that that commit was updated today. So that's just a quick demonstration of the new source control pane that gives you quick access for convenience to a lot of source control commands, either from Git or Subversion. Another thing I'd like to show is the new threading capability we've added for 7.1. So typically in Team Developer, if you have a long-running task that you'd like to run, those in previous versions of Team Developer all had to be done on the user interface thread. And so those long-running tasks would block the user interface while they ran. Now with 7.1, we've added a new class type called a background worker class. And in these classes, you can put in style code which you'd like to run in a background thread that won't block the user interface. So these background worker classes look a lot like a functional class, except they have this thread start section here. And this is where you would like to put any style code that would run in a background worker. Now these classes can derive from a functional class, so you can import existing code you already have and simply derive from it if you have existing style code you'd like to make use of. And that's what this example is doing. So in this thread start section, we're setting up some database parameters, and then we're calling a function in the base class that fetches some SQL data. So this would be an expensive query that might take, say, several seconds to run, and you don't want to block the user interface. So we're going to go ahead and put it in a background worker class. Now you give these background worker classes a name just like you would a functional class, and then you can make use of them on your window classes. So here I have a form, and we have this new background threads outline section, and you can add an instance of your background worker class here, and you give it an instance name. So very similar to adding like a variable reference on your form. Now, these background worker classes cannot access the user interface in any way. They're completely separate. So you need some mechanism to monitor the progress or communicate progress events back to your user interface. And you do that by adding thread events to that worker instance. And these events are all ran back on the user interface thread. So from your background worker, you might want to periodically say, okay, I've processed 10 files, I've processed 20 files, and give some type of progress. So in here, I have an example. So in my background worker code here, I'm calling our API SAL background worker report progress and passing in just some string messages. And in our loop here, as we process records, I'm sending notifications about how many number of records have been fetched. So back on my user interface thread, then I can respond to those events. And in this example, I'm just updating a progress bar, and then I'm logging those messages in a list box just so we can show them as they come in. And we have several of these events, so you can notify the user when the thread starts, when it finishes, if an error occurs. It's also very easy to spawn these background workers. We have an API that you simply call with the name of the thread. So we just say SAL background worker start, and we pass in the name of our worker instance, and it's as simple as that. So I'll go ahead and run this example. So I'll go ahead and spawn this background worker. As you can see, it's fetching records in the background. And I can go, and my user interface is still responsive. I can populate grids, the user can interact, they can still interact with the user interface while this thread is running. And I can query the state of that thread, and it went ahead and finished, and then I populated a grid from the information that was fetched in that background worker. So that's just a quick demonstration of how you can keep your user interface responsive while running expensive background tasks, which is a nice new feature in 7.1. I'd also like to show the new capability we've added to allow you to leverage WPF controls in Win32 applications. As Martin mentioned, we've had this capability for our .NET build targets, but we have also added this capability now for Win32 build targets as well. So these are very simple to use. You just drop a WPF custom control onto your layout, and these controls have a XAML attribute, and you just put in your XAML snippet, and that control will be rendered and initialized. So these here are using some telerec gauges, but you could use any control, and it's, for instance, WPF has a built-in calendar control. So I can just type that in my XAML snippet here, and you can see it renders, and I can make use of this pretty easily. We have a rich set of SAL APIs that you can use to interact with these controls. So you can set properties using these SAL WPF API calls here. Then go ahead and run this example here, and you can see it brought up my form with these gauges, and this is that new calendar control I just added. I can interact with these using the API, so it updated the value of this meter control. So again, this is something that we've had for .NET, and we've added it for the Win32 build types as well now. Lastly, I'd like to show the active coding assistance improvements we made for 7.1. So we've improved our active coding assistant tooltip to show documentation now, which is a lot more useful. So here I have a window function which I have added some documentation for. So I have a description specified for it, and I have also documented each of the parameters as well. And now when I go and bring up the active coding assistant, you'll see that we get a nice tooltip that includes the documentation for each parameter. As I go to type in each parameter, it highlights that in the tooltip and shows the documentation for it below. I can also hover over the function to get the documentation, the function documentation, or I could view that with the quick info as well. Now we've done this for user specified functions, but have also documented all of our system calls. So so this is like a SQL Connect.net. You'll see we have nice parameter documentation for all of the parameters here. As you type these in, you get all the information, and we try to be as helpful as we can. Here in this case, we provided all of the constant names and values that are supported. So this would be a really handy feature as you're not relying so much on our embedded help file. So that completes the demo. I will now hand it back to Martin for our Q&A.
Okay, great. This is Carrie here. So we're going to move on to our question and answer session so that our presenters have a chance to answer any questions you might have. So one question that did come up was the app source files. Does the app source files change to UTF-8? They're asking because GIF doesn't accept UTF-16 files.
I am not sure if we have changed the encoding of the source files, but I mean, obviously we've tested checking files in and out of Git, and they've accepted our application source files.
So just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can just type it into the right panel of your screen on the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to answer any other questions. Okay, Martin or Gary, are there any additional points you'd like to make to our attendees before I wrap up this session?
Yeah, thank you for attending this TD 7.1 preview, and I hope you're all excited about this release that will be available very soon for you all. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so at this time we need to wrap up today's session. I encourage everyone to continue sending in your questions. Just one more, they'd like to know because they start to use GIF here, but UTF-16 is not accepted. So, so Gary, maybe you can liaise directly. I don't know if you see that question there in the box. Yeah,
so I can't recall. I'd have to double check with the engineer who implemented this feature if we had to change the encoding or not. But my point was that we've tested checking in and cloning out of Git, and there was no issue. So I assume if we had to make a change there, we did.
Okay. Okay, well, we'll have this filed, and then if there's any follow-up, then I'll leave that to you. Okay. So just a reminder that today's webinar was recorded, so within a short time you'll be able to find the recording and the PowerPoint on my support page at support.opennext.com/go/webinar. We'll also be sending out an email with all these materials attached. So I'll leave this meeting open for another 5 minutes or so, and our presenters will follow up with you if there's any other questions. But thanks again to Gary and Martin for delivering the presentation today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a great day and talk soon.